Commander Vexlar stood at the viewing port of Unity Prime Station, watching the human vessel approach. The ship was different from anything in the Galactic Confederation fleet. Where their ships were smooth and elegant, the human craft looked aggressive, covered in armor plates and weapon ports. It moved with purpose, cutting through space like a predator. Vexlar had lived for 200 years. He had met dozens of alien species in his time as a Confederation officer. But humans were new, and they made the Council nervous. The Therian commander adjusted his uniform and prepared to meet them. His people had not fought a real war in 6,000 years. Peace was everything to the Confederation. He wondered if these newcomers understood that. The airlock hissed open, and two humans stepped through. The first was a tall man with short dark hair and sharp eyes. He wore a dark blue uniform with metal badges on his chest. The second was a woman with red hair tied back, her green eyes taking in everything around her with quick precision. Both moved with a confidence that seemed almost dangerous. "Commander Vexlar," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Captain Jake Morrison, and this is Lieutenant Amy Walsh. We're honored to be here." Vexlar studied the extended hand for a moment before grasping it. The human custom of handshaking was still strange to him. Jake's grip was firm, warm. Amy shook his hand as well, and he noticed calluses on her palm. These were not soft diplomats. "Welcome to Unity Prime," Vexlar said. "The Council is eager to meet your delegation." As they walked through the station's gleaming corridors, Jake and Amy looked at everything with open curiosity. Other species moved past them, some staring at the humans with uncertainty. The Confederation was ancient and vast, 47 species living in harmony. Humans were the first newcomers in 3,000 years. "Your station is impressive," Amy said. "How long did it take to build?" 200 years, Vexlar replied. "We do not rush such projects." Jake whistled softly. 200 years. We could build something this size in 5, maybe less if we pushed. Vexlar felt a flutter of concern. Humans did everything fast. They had developed faster-than-light travel in just 300 years of space exploration. It had taken the Therians over 2,000 years to achieve the same breakthrough. This speed, this urgency, worried the Council. What drove humans to hurry so much? The Council chamber was a massive circular room, with representatives from all 47 species arranged in tiers. At the center stood the High Arbiter, a being of pure energy named Luxon, who had guided the Confederation for 4,000 years. The lights dimmed as Jake and Amy entered. "Humans of Earth," Luxon's voice echoed like wind chimes. "You seek membership in our Confederation. What can you offer us besides your impressive technology?" Jake stepped forward. "We offer friendship, cooperation, and our best efforts to maintain peace. We know we're young compared to your civilization. We've made mistakes, but we're learning, and we want to learn from you." "You come from a world of conflict," one council member said. The speaker was a Velthian, a species that looked like walking crystals. "Your history is filled with wars. How can we trust you will embrace our ways of peace?" Amy spoke this time. "Because we know the cost of war better than anyone. We've fought each other for thousands of years. We've seen what violence destroys. That's exactly why we want to join you. We want to build something better." Vexlar watched Jake and Amy wait patiently, never showing frustration. Finally, Luxon spoke again. "We will grant provisional membership, but you must prove yourselves worthy of full inclusion. Commander Vexlar will serve as your liaison. He will help you understand our ways." After the ceremony, Vexlar took Jake and Amy to the officers' lounge. The view showed a dozen different ships from across the Confederation, each unique to its species. They sat at a table, and Vexlar ordered drinks. "Your technology is remarkable, Vexlar said. Your faster-than-light drives are more efficient than ours. How did you develop them so quickly? Jake leaned back in his chair. Necessity. We needed to expand beyond Earth. Resources were running low, populations growing. We had to figure it out, or face serious problems. We have never had such pressures, Vexlar admitted. The Confederation shares resources freely. No species goes without. That sounds like paradise, Amy said, but there was something odd in her voice. Not quite doubt, but not quite belief either. Over the next weeks, Vexlar spent time with the human delegation. He learned about Earth, a world that seemed impossibly violent to him. Humans had fought wars over land, resources, ideas, and religion. They had nearly destroyed themselves with nuclear weapons. Yet they had also created beautiful art, music, and literature. They laughed easily and often. They formed deep friendships quickly. One evening, Jake invited Vexlar to the human ship's recreation room. Several human officers were there, including a young pilot named Ben Carter. They were telling stories about their military service, laughing about dangerous situations that should have killed them. And then the engine died, Ben was saying, and I'm falling through the atmosphere with no thrust, just hoping the backup kicks in before I become a crater. Everyone laughed. Vexlar felt confused. You nearly died. Why is this funny? Jake smiled. Because he didn't die. Sometimes you laugh at the scary stuff to deal with it. Keeps you sane. We do not understand this, Vexlar said slowly. Death is tragedy. It is never amusing. Amy's expression turned serious. You're right, death isn't funny. But fear is part of life for us. We've learned to live with it, even joke about it. Otherwise it would paralyze us. Vexlar thought about this for a long time. The Confederation had eliminated most dangers from their lives. They lived in safety, comfort, and peace. Fear was something they studied in historical texts. But humans lived with fear daily, and had built their entire civilization while carrying that weight. 3 months later, everything changed. A Confederation colony world called Kelmar's Hope sent a distress signal. Then the signal stopped. When the reconnaissance team arrived, they found nothing. The colony was gone. The atmosphere was stripped away. The buildings were empty shells. 5 million beings had simply vanished. The council convened an emergency session. Vexlar stood with Jake and Amy in the gallery, watching the chaos below. More reports came in. 2 more colonies had gone silent. Long-range sensors detected massive ships, unlike anything in their databases, moving through Confederation space. The Devourers, Luxon announced, his voice heavy with ancient memory. They have returned. Jake looked at Vexlar. Devourers, you faced them before? 12,000 years ago, Vexlar said quietly, before the Confederation was formed. They consumed entire worlds. Our ancestors fled, found each other, built this alliance to survive. We thought they had moved beyond our galaxy. Amy's face was grim. They're back, and you haven't fought a war since then. The Council mobilized the peacekeeping fleet. Admiral Krenzix, the most experienced military officer in the Confederation, took command. Vexlar watched the fleet assemble, hundreds of ships preparing for battle. They outnumbered the enemy forces. They had superior technology. Victory seemed certain. Jake found Vexlar before the fleet departed. Commander, I want to volunteer the Vigilant for the operation. We can help. Vexlar appreciated the offer but felt confident. Thank you, Captain, but we have this under control. We are more than capable. The words would haunt him forever, because 4 days later, the fleet engaged the Devourers at Kelmar Station, and in 4 hours, the Confederation fleet was destroyed. The command center fell silent as the last transmission from the fleet cut out. Vexlar stared at the tactical display, watching the blue icons representing Confederation ships blink out one by one. 300 vessels had entered the Kelmar system. Only 15 were retreating. The rest were gone. "This cannot be happening," someone whispered behind him. But it was happening. The display showed the Devourer fleet advancing, their red icons moving deeper into Confederation space. They were not stopping. They were not even slowing down. The victory had been so complete, so crushing, that the enemy did not need to pause to regroup. Vexlar felt something he had never experienced before. His hands trembled. His breathing came too fast. The rooms seemed to spin around him. This was fear, real fear, not the abstract concept he had studied in history courses. His people had forgotten what this felt like. Jake Morrison appeared at his side. The human captain looked exhausted, his uniform torn and stained. The Vigilant had been part of the fleet, one of the few ships to survive. "Commander," Jake said quietly, "we need to talk." They found a quiet room away from the chaos. Amy Walsh was already there, along with General Pete Crawford, the senior human military officer. Pete was older than Jake, with gray hair and scars on his face. He had fought in Earth's last major war before unification. "What happened out there?" Vexlar asked. "We had more ships, better technology. Admiral Krenzix had every advantage." Jake exchanged a look with Pete before speaking. "The Admiral fought by the book. Perfect formations, textbook maneuvers, minimal risk protocols. It should have worked." "But it didn't," Amy said, "because the Devourers don't follow any book. They attacked in ways that made no tactical sense. They sacrificed ships to create openings. They adapted every time our fleet tried a new strategy." Pete leaned forward. "Your people haven't fought a real war in thousands of years. You've forgotten what war actually is. It's not neat. It's not logical. It's chaos and blood and making terrible choices in seconds." Vexlar wanted to argue, but he had watched the battle recordings. He had seen Confederation ships destroyed because their commanders hesitated, trying to find the optimal solution when any solution would have been better than none. He had seen crews abandon ships that could have been saved because they feared casualties more than defeat. "The Council is meeting now," Vexlar said. "They are discussing options." "Options?" Pete's voice was hard. "Commander, you don't have options. You have one choice: fight or die. Those things out there won't negotiate. They'll consume every world in the Confederation unless someone stops them." Over the next week, the situation grew worse. The Devourers moved through 5 more systems. Refugee ships flooded toward the core worlds, carrying billions of displaced beings. The Confederation tried to mount a defense at the Hadrian system, but without a coordinated military strategy, it was chaos. The Council called for Vexlar. He entered the chamber expecting orders, maybe a new assignment. Instead, he found them arguing about whether to abandon the outer colonies entirely. "We cannot fight them," one council member insisted. "We must focus on protecting the core worlds. If we abandon the colonies, billions will die," another countered. "Better some than all," the first replied. Vexlar felt sick. These were supposed to be the wisest beings in the galaxy, and they were discussing surrender after one defeat. Then Luxon spoke, and the chamber fell silent. "There is one option we have not considered," the High Arbiter said. "The humans have offered their assistance. Perhaps we should accept." The chamber erupted in protest. Humans were too young, too violent, too unreliable. They had been provisional members for mere months. How could they be trusted with the fate of the Confederation? But Luxon's voice cut through the noise. "They are the only ones among us who remember how to fight. Pride is worthless to the dead." The vote was close, but it passed. The Confederation formally requested human military assistance. Earth's response came within hours. They would send 10,000 military advisors, along with 20 warships, to supplement the Confederation fleet. Vexlar was assigned to the newly formed Joint Defense Force. His first briefing was unlike anything he had experienced. The room was full of human officers studying tactical displays, arguing loudly about strategy, moving pieces around a map with casual confidence. General Pete Crawford stood at the head of the table. "Listen up. We have maybe 2 weeks before the Devourers hit Hadrian. That's our line in the sand. We hold there, or we lose the entire outer rim." "What about the civilians on Hadrian Prime?" someone asked. 2 million people. "We evacuate as many as we can," Pete said, "but priority 1 is stopping the enemy advance. If we lose the fleet, those civilians die anyway, along with everyone else." Vexlar felt his stomach turn. The casual way Pete discussed acceptable losses was horrifying. But looking around the room, he saw Confederation officers from a dozen species, and they were listening. They were learning. Amy Walsh approached him after the briefing. "I know this is hard for you, the way we talk about casualties, about sacrifice, but it's necessary." Vexlar asked, "How can you be so calm about death? How do you plan operations knowing people will die?" Amy's green eyes were sad. "We're not calm about it. Every death hurts. But if we let that stop us from making hard choices, more people die. It's that simple and that terrible." Over the following days, Vexlar attended training sessions. Human instructors taught Confederation crews about combat maneuvers that seemed reckless. They learned about fighting retreats, tactical sacrifices, and something the humans called acceptable risk. A young Therian officer named Keltor struggled with a simulation. The scenario required him to send part of his fleet into danger to save the rest. He froze, unable to give the order. Lieutenant Ben Carter, the human pilot Vexlar had met months ago, sat down next to Keltor. "I know what you're feeling. First time I had to make a call like this, I threw up afterward." "How do you do it?" Keltor asked. Ben was quiet for a moment. "You remember why you're fighting. Those ships you're sending into danger, their crews know the risks. They signed up to protect others. Honor that by making their sacrifice count." The training continued. Vexlar watched his people change. They stopped seeking perfect solutions and started accepting good enough ones. They learned to trust their instincts instead of always waiting for orders. They began to understand that fear was not something to eliminate, but something to push through. Jake Morrison found Vexlar in the observation deck late one night. The human captain looked tired. Everyone looked tired these days. "Can't sleep?" Jake asked. "I keep thinking about Kelmar Station," Vexlar admitted. "All those ships destroyed. I served with some of those crews for decades." Jake nodded slowly. "After my first real battle, I had nightmares for months. Still do sometimes. But you know what helps? Knowing that their deaths weren't meaningless. We learned from that disaster. We're stronger now." "Are we strong enough?" Vexlar asked. "We're about to find out." The Devourer fleet was 3 days from Hadrian. Long-range scans showed over 1,000 enemy vessels. The Joint Defense Force had assembled 400 ships, a mix of Confederation and human vessels. The odds were terrible. General Pete Crawford addressed the entire fleet via transmission. Vexlar watched from the bridge of his new assignment, the CDF Starlight, a heavy cruiser with a mixed crew. "In 3 days, we fight for everything," Pete said. "Some of you have never been in real combat before. You're scared. That's good. Fear keeps you sharp. But remember, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done, despite that fear." Around the bridge, Vexlar's crew looked at each other. There were Therians like him, 3 humans, including Lieutenant Ben Carter as tactical officer, 2 Velthians, and a Kree navigator. Different species, different worlds, but all facing the same enemy. "All stations report ready," Ben announced. Vexlar took a deep breath, set course for Hadrian, maximum speed. The fleet moved out together, heading toward the most important battle the Confederation had ever fought. Vexlar looked at his crew and saw their fear, but he also saw their determination. The humans had taught them well. Now they would see if the lessons had been learned well enough. The Joint Defense Force training facility occupied an entire deck of Unity Prime Station. Vexlar entered the main hall and found organized chaos. Human instructors moved between groups of Confederation officers, demonstrating tactics on holographic displays. Shouts echoed across the space as crews ran combat drills. Lieutenant Amy Walsh spotted him and waved him over. She stood with a group of Therian officers, all looking uncomfortable as they studied a tactical scenario. "Commander Vexlar, perfect timing," Amy said. "Help me explain the concept of a fighting retreat to your people." One of the Therian officers, a female named Kirisin, spoke up. "Lieutenant Walsh wants us to deliberately abandon a defensive position. This goes against everything we know about military honor." Amy sighed. "It's not about honor. It's about surviving to fight another day. Look at the scenario. You're outnumbered 3-1. Staying in position means total destruction. Falling back means you lose some ground, but preserve your forces for a counterattack." "But we would be running away," another Therian said. Vexlar studied the scenario. Before meeting the humans, he would have agreed with his fellow officers. Retreat was shameful. But he had watched the recordings from Kelmar Station 100 times now. He had seen what happened when commanders chose honor over wisdom. "Running away and tactical retreat are different things," Vexlar said quietly. "One is cowardice, the other is strategy. The humans are right about this." Kirisin looked shocked, but she returned to studying the scenario with new eyes. Amy gave Vexlar a small nod of thanks. Over the next week, the training intensified. General Pete Crawford pushed everyone hard. The Confederation officers learned about things that seemed wrong at first, but started to make sense. They practiced communications under stress, learned to make decisions with incomplete information, and ran simulations where there were no good options, only less terrible ones. During a break, Vexlar found Jake Morrison in the mess hall. The human captain was eating something that smelled strange. Human food often did. "How are your people handling the training?" Jake asked. "They are struggling," Vexlar admitted, sitting down across from him. 6,000 years of peace does not prepare you for war. We have forgotten so much." Jake set down his fork. "You haven't forgotten. You never knew. There's a difference. Your civilization evolved past the need for war. That's actually amazing. What we're teaching you now, these are lessons we learned by making terrible mistakes for thousands of years." "Did you ever wish your people could forget about war?" Vexlar asked. "Every day," Jake said softly, "but we can't. We fought each other, fought nature, fought for survival since we lived in caves. Violence is coded into our history. Does it ever get easier? Making decisions that cost lives?" Jake's expression darkened. "No. And if it ever does, that's when you need to stop. The day it becomes easy is the day you've lost your humanity." The training continued. Vexlar noticed changes in the Confederation crews. They moved faster, talked louder, argued more. The humans encouraged debate, even disagreement, as long as it led to better decisions. This was very different from Confederation culture, where harmony and consensus were valued above all. During one simulation, a crisis occurred. The scenario involved defending a convoy of civilian transports from enemy attack. The defending ships were outnumbered and outgunned. The simulation program malfunctioned, making the scenario even harder than intended. A young Kree officer named Velmos was in command. As the situation deteriorated, Vexlar watched the officer's panic grow. The Kree froze at the command console, unable to give orders, as his simulated fleet was destroyed piece by piece. Lieutenant Ben Carter moved quickly to Velmos's side. The human pilot didn't take over. Instead, He spoke calmly. Velmos, listen to me. Breathe. Good. Now what's your priority? The transports, Velmos managed to say. Right. What do you need to protect them? Time. I need more time. How do you get time? Velmos's eyes widened with understanding. A sacrifice. I send my damaged ships to delay the enemy while the transports escape. Do it. Velmos gave the orders. In the simulation, 2 of his ships died buying time for the civilians to reach safety. The rest of his fleet survived to fight another day. It was not a perfect solution. It was costly and painful. But it worked. After the simulation ended, Velmos sat at his station, shaking. Ben sat beside him. I killed my own people, Velmos said. No, Ben replied firmly. You saved the transports. Those crews on the damaged ships were already doomed. You gave their deaths meaning by using the time they bought you. That's command. That's war. Vexlar thought about Ben's words for a long time. The humans had a different relationship with death. They accepted it as inevitable, but fought to make each death count for something. It was a strange philosophy, practical, yet almost spiritual. The next day, Amy Walsh conducted a lecture on psychological warfare. She explained how fear could be used as a weapon, how to break enemy morale, how to project strength even when weak. The Devourers use fear very effectively, Amy said. They attack in overwhelming numbers. They consume everything. They leave nothing behind. Planets surrender before they even arrive. How do we fight against that? Kirasin asked. You fight fear with courage, Amy said. Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. You show the enemy that you won't break. You make them bleed for every meter they advance. You make victory so costly they start to doubt themselves. A Velthian officer raised a crystalline appendage, but the Devourers are a hive mind. They do not feel doubt. Amy smiled grimly. Everything feels doubt when it starts losing. We'll teach them. That evening, Vexlar joined a group of human officers in their recreation area. They had invited several Confederation officers to what they called poker night. The card game was complicated, but Vexlar was starting to understand the basics. What fascinated him more was the conversation. The humans talked about their families back on Earth, about their fears for the upcoming battle, about their hopes for the future. They were open with their emotions in a way Confederation people rarely were. Jake dealt another hand. My daughter just turned 6. I missed her birthday for this training. You have a child? Vexlar asked, surprised. Jake had never mentioned this before. Yeah, Rachel. She's the reason I'm here. I want her to grow up in a galaxy where she doesn't have to be afraid. Jake studied his cards. That means fighting now, so she doesn't have to later. Ben threw down his cards in disgust. I fold. And Jake, you're making us all emotional. That's not fair during poker. Everyone laughed, but the laughter had an edge to it. They were days away from the Battle of Hadrian. Everyone knew many of them would not survive. Yet they laughed and played cards and talked about normal things, because that was how they dealt with the weight of what was coming. Later, Vexlar walked with Amy through the station's observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly before them. Your people are very strange, Vexlar said. You face death with humor. You accept terrible costs. You plan for your own casualties. Yet you also care deeply. I do not understand how you balance these things. Amy was quiet for a moment. We don't balance them. They exist together all the time. We love fiercely because we know we can lose each other. We laugh because otherwise we'd cry. We accept costs because refusing to pay them costs more. Are you afraid of the battle ahead? Vexlar asked. Terrified, Amy admitted. I'm afraid I'll make a mistake that gets people killed. I'm afraid I won't be brave enough when it matters. I'm afraid of dying and never seeing home again. Then how can you go into battle? Amy smiled sadly, because being afraid doesn't mean you can't act. It means you understand what you're risking. The people who aren't afraid either don't understand the stakes or don't care about them. I'd rather be scared and useful than fearless and reckless. The final briefing came 2 days before the battle. General Pete Crawford stood before the entire command staff of the Joint Defense Force. The room held hundreds of officers from dozens of species. "In 48 hours, we engage the enemy at Hadrian," Pete said. "Our mission is simple. Hold them long enough to evacuate the civilians. After that, we fight until we win or we die. There is no middle ground." He paused, looking across the room. "You've trained hard, you've learned fast, but this won't be a simulation. The enemy won't pause when you make mistakes. Your friends will die, your ships will burn, and you'll have to keep fighting anyway." The room was silent. "But here's what the Devourers don't understand," Pete continued. "They think fear makes you weak. They're wrong. It makes you value what you're defending. And when you fight for something you're afraid of losing, you fight harder than anyone who has nothing to lose." Vexlar looked around and saw his people, really saw them. Therians, Velthians, Kree, humans, all the species of the Confederation. They were afraid, all of them. But they were ready. The CDF Starlight moved into position in the darkness of space. Vexlar stood on the bridge, watching the tactical display. 400 ships from the Joint Defense Force formed a defensive wall around Hadrian Prime. Behind them, transport vessels worked frantically to evacuate 2 million civilians. They needed 12 hours. The enemy would arrive in 2. "All stations reporting ready," Lieutenant Ben Carter announced from the tactical station. The human's voice was steady, but Vexlar noticed how his hands moved across the controls, checking and rechecking every system. Around the bridge, a mixed crew performed their duties with practiced efficiency. Weeks of training had bonded them together. Kirasin at navigation, 2 Velthians at engineering, a Kree communications officer, and 3 humans at various stations. Different species, united by necessity. "Enemy fleet detected at system edge," the communications officer announced, counting over 1,000 vessels. Vexlar felt his hearts racing. The Therians had 2 hearts, and right now both were pounding. He looked at the numbers on the display. 1,000 against 400. The odds were worse than Kelmar Station. General Pete Crawford's voice came through on the command channel. "All ships, this is Crawford. You know the mission. We hold this line. We give those transports time. Some of you won't make it home. But every minute we fight saves thousands of lives. Make it count." The Devourer fleet approached like a dark tide. Their ships were organic-looking, twisted things that seemed to absorb light. They moved in perfect coordination, the hive mind controlling every vessel with precision. "They're splitting into 3 groups," Ben reported. "Classic encirclement pattern." "Human vessels, take point positions," Jake Morrison's voice came through the channel. "Confederation ships, support formation. Remember your training." The first enemy wave hit like a hammer. Devourer vessels dove into the defensive line with no regard for their own safety. They rammed, they exploded, they attacked from every angle at once. The Joint Defense Force returned fire, but for every enemy ship destroyed, 2 more took its place. "Enemy destroyer targeting our port side," Kirasin called out. "Evasive maneuver Delta 3, Vexlar ordered. The Starlight rolled, dodging the worst of the enemy fire. Ben returned fire, his targeting solutions precise, despite the chaos. An explosion lit up the view screen. The CDF Aurora, a Velthian cruiser, broke apart under concentrated fire. 300 crew members died in an instant. Vexlar had served with the Aurora's captain for 50 years. "Stay focused," Ben said quietly, seeing Vexlar's expression. "We grieve later. Fight now." The battle became a nightmare of fire and death. Ships exploded all around them. The communications channel filled with desperate calls for help, damage reports, final messages. Vexlar forced himself to shut out the noise and focus on his own ship, his own crew. Transport Convoy Alpha reporting clear, the communications officer announced. Jumping to hyperspace. 1 down. 7 convoys to go. The USS Defiant, a human destroyer, suddenly accelerated toward a group of Devourer battlecruisers. They were targeting a medical frigate full of wounded personnel. The Defiant rammed the lead enemy ship, both vessels exploding in a ball of plasma. Defiant is gone, someone reported. 400 humans had just died to save 800 wounded. Amy Walsh's voice cut through the chaos. All ships, focus fire on Sector 7. Their formation is weakening there. Push through. The Joint Defense Force adapted, ships covering each other, pulling back when damaged, rotating fresh vessels to the front line. The humans had taught them this. The constant flow of battle, the acceptance that you could not save everyone. 3 hours into the battle, the Starlight's shields failed. Vexlar felt the ship shudder as enemy fire raked across the hull. Hull breach on Deck 4, engineering reported. Emergency force fields holding. Shields offline, Ben said. We need to fall back. A Devourer destroyer locked weapons on them. Vexlar could see it on the display. Targeting solutions calculating their doom. There was nowhere to run. Then the USS Vigilance swept in, Jake Morrison's ship taking the hit meant for the Starlight. The Vigilance shields held, barely. Starlight, get to the repair frigate, Jake ordered. We'll cover you. Captain Morrison, your shields are at 15%, Vexlar protested. Which is 15% more than yours. Move, Commander. That's an order. The Starlight limped toward the rear of the formation. Vexlar watched the Vigilant continue fighting, taking hit after hit to protect their withdrawal. This was what the humans did. They stood between danger and those who needed protection. They did it knowing the cost. 4 hours in, they had evacuated 4 convoys, 4 more to go. But the defensive line was crumbling. They had lost 70 ships. The enemy kept coming. We're not going to make it, Kirison said quietly. Vexlar looked at his navigator. She was right. The mathematics were brutal. At this rate, the enemy would break through before the last transports could escape. Ben Carter looked up from his station. Then we changed the mathematics. Commander, I have an idea. It's crazy, but it might work. 5 minutes later, Vexlar was explaining Ben's plan to General Crawford. It was insane, but it might give the transports the time they needed. Do it, Pete said simply. 20 ships, all heavily damaged, volunteered for the suicide run. They would charge straight into the enemy center, drawing the Devourer's attention and focus. The rest of the fleet would collapse the formation, creating a tighter defensive sphere around the transports. The Starlight had partial shields back. Vexlar volunteered his ship for the attack. No, Ben said firmly. Sir, with respect, we need you alive. You're the best Confederation commander we have. I'll lead this run. This is my ship, Vexlar said. And my idea, Ben replied. Besides, I'm just a tactical officer. You're a commander. Your death costs more. Before Vexlar could argue, Ben left the bridge, heading for one of the damaged human frigates that had volunteered for the mission. Amy Walsh tried to stop him, but Ben just hugged her quickly and kept moving. Vexlar watched from the Starlight's bridge as 20 ships broke formation and charged into the enemy fleet. They fired everything they had, ramming when their weapons ran dry, exploding when they had nothing left to give. Ben Carter's frigate lasted 3 minutes before enemy fire tore it apart, but those 3 minutes let another transport convoy escape. The battle raged for 8 more hours, the defensive line held by centimeters and willpower. Ships fought until they had no weapons left, then used themselves as shields. Crews stayed at their posts, even as their vessels burned around them. Lieutenant Amy Walsh's destroyer took a direct hit to the engineering section. She kept fighting, with half her ship vented to space and fires burning across 3 decks. Jake Morrison's Vigilant lost main power, but continued using auxiliary systems, firing any weapon that still worked. Vexlar pushed his crew and his ship beyond every limit. They took hits that should have destroyed them. They fought when exhaustion made every movement agony. They did not quit. Last transport convoy reporting clear. The communications officer announced, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. All civilians evacuated. All ships fighting retreat, General Crawford ordered. You've done your job. Now we get as many of you home as possible. The Joint Defense Force pulled back in good order, covering each other, making the enemy pay for every meter. The Devourers pursued but seemed less coordinated now, less certain. They had expected easy prey. They had found warriors instead. As the Starlight jumped to hyperspace, Vexlar looked at the casualty reports. 63 ships destroyed, 20,000 personnel dead. Ben Carter was among them. But 2 million civilians lived. And for the first time since the war began, the Devourers had been stopped. Vexlar found a quiet corner of the ship, and finally allowed himself to feel everything he had been holding back. The fear, the grief, the exhaustion. He thought about Ben, who had volunteered for a mission he knew was suicide. He thought about all the humans who had died protecting people from worlds they had never even visited. He understood now. The humans were not fearless. They were terrified. Every single one of them. But they fought anyway, because they understood something the Confederation had forgotten during 6,000 years of peace. And knowing that, truly understanding it deep in your soul, that was courage. That was the real face of fear, not running from it, but facing it directly and choosing to act anyway. The war was far from over, but the Confederation had learned to fight, and they had learned from the best teachers in the galaxy. 2 years after the Battle of Hadrian, Vexlar stood in the rebuilt command center on Unity Prime Station. The war had changed everything. The Confederation was no longer a peaceful alliance of species who had forgotten conflict. They were warriors now, hardened by necessity, shaped by loss. The tactical display showed the final engagement at Proxima Reach. The last Devourer hive ship burned in the darkness, its organic hull tearing apart under concentrated fire from a joint fleet. After 2 years of grinding warfare, the enemy was finally broken. Around the command center, officers from a dozen species watched the hive ship die. Nobody cheered. They had all lost too much to celebrate death, even the death of their enemy. All enemy vessels destroyed or retreating, the communications officer reported. The system is clear. General Pete Crawford, older now with more gray in his hair and new scars on his face, nodded slowly. Send the all clear. Begin recovery operations. And someone get me a damage report. Vexlar had been promoted to Admiral after Hadrian. He had led fleets in 8 major engagements, earned decorations from both the Confederation and Earth, and trained a new generation of officers who understood that peace sometimes required the willingness to fight. But the cost haunted him. 20,000 had died at Hadrian. That number had grown to 60,000 over 2 years of war. Human names filled the casualty lists far beyond their proportion of the Joint Defense Force. They had stood at the front in every major battle, taking the hardest assignments, suffering the highest losses. The victory celebrations began across Confederation space. People danced in the streets of 100 worlds, grateful that the nightmare was over. But in the military quarters, the mood was quieter. Soldiers understood what victory had cost. Vexlar found Jake Morrison in the observation deck. The human captain stood before the large viewport, watching the stars. His ship, the Vigilant, had survived the war but bore scars from dozens of battles. "Captain," Vexlar said quietly. "Admiral," Jake replied with a small smile. "We did it. The war is over." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Vexlar asked the question that had troubled him since Hadrian. Why did your people sacrifice so much for us? 60,000 humans died defending Confederation worlds. Worlds you had only known for months before the war began. Why? Jake was quiet for a long time. Because it was the right thing to do. Because running away means letting evil win. We've made that mistake before in our own history, and we learn the hard way what happens when good people do nothing. But the cost, Vexlar said. Your people paid so much. Freedom always costs, Jake replied. So does civilization, justice, and peace. The question is whether you're willing to pay the price or let others suffer because you're afraid of the bill. Lieutenant Amy Walsh joined them. She walked with a cane now, injuries from the Battle of Centauri Ridge that had nearly killed her. Her destroyer had taken a direct hit to the bridge. She had continued commanding from engineering until she passed out from blood loss. The memorial service is in an hour, Amy said. We should go. The memorial wall on Unity Prime had grown vast. It now held the names of every being who had died fighting the Devourers. 60,000 humans, 40,000 Confederation personnel, carved into stone that would last 10,000 years. Vexlar walked along the wall, reading names. Then Carter, the young pilot who had taught him about courage in the face of fear. Commander Keltor, a Tharian who had overcome his terror to lead a brilliant defense of Kepler Station. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, who had died holding a damaged reactor together long enough for her crew to evacuate. The memorial service was simple. No grand speeches, no political words. General Pete Crawford spoke for 5 minutes about duty and sacrifice. Then they observed silence, each person lost in their own memories of the dead. Afterward, Vexlar found himself walking with Jake and Amy through the gardens of Unity Prime. The station had been expanded, reinforced, turned from a diplomatic outpost into a military headquarters. But they had kept the gardens, needed them even more now. What will you do now? Vexlar asked them. The war is over. Will your people return to Earth? Some will, Jake said, but many of us have decided to stay. The Confederation is our home now too. We fought for it, bled for it. We're not leaving. Besides, Amy added, you still need training officers. The war is over, but the galaxy is still dangerous. Someone needs to make sure the next generation knows how to defend what we've built. Over the following months, the Confederation rebuilt, but it was different now. The military academy, once a small institution training peacekeepers, became a major center of learning. Officers from every species studied together, learning from human instructors and from their own experiences. Vexlar was offered a position teaching advanced tactics. On his first day, he looked at his classroom full of young cadets from dozens of worlds, and saw himself 3 years ago. Innocent, certain that civilization meant never having to fight. Welcome, he said to them. You are here to learn about war. Not because we want war, but because peace requires the ability to defend it. You will learn to be afraid, and to act despite that fear. You will learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it. Sir, were you afraid during the war? Every day, Vexlar answered honestly. Every battle, every decision. Fear kept me sharp, kept me from making careless choices. The humans taught me that. He told them about Hadrian, about Ben Carter's sacrifice, about watching ships burn and making choices that cost lives. He did not make war sound glorious. He made it sound like what it was, terrible, necessary, and something to be avoided when possible, but faced when required. After class, a group of human cadets approached him. They were children of the soldiers who had fought in the war, some of them orphaned by it. Admiral Vexlar, one of them said, my father served under you at Centauri Ridge. He used to write letters about you, about how you learned to lead in battle. Vexlar felt his eyes burn with unexpected emotion. What was your father's name? Lieutenant David Green. He died when the engine core breached. But his last message said, He was proud to serve with you. Vexlar remembered David Green, a quiet man who always had a joke to lighten the mood, who had stayed at his post when the ship was dying to give everyone else more time to evacuate. Your father was a hero, Vexlar said. He taught me that bravery is not about wanting to die. It is about choosing what is worth living for and protecting it no matter the cost. The Confederation was changing in other ways too. The species were closer now, bound by shared sacrifice. Humans integrated fully into society, no longer provisional members, but equals who had proven themselves in the hardest way possible. New ships joined the fleet, designs that combined Confederation technology with human tactical thinking. The old formations gave way to more flexible strategies. The officers who had survived the war trained the next generation, passing on lessons learned in blood and fire. Vexlar visited Earth for the first time a year after the war ended. Jake had invited him to meet his family. The planet was beautiful, blue and green, with clouds swirling across the surface. But it also showed scars from humanity's violent history. Monuments to old wars, rebuilt cities, reminders of conflicts that had once torn the world apart. Jake's daughter, Rachel, was 8 now. She ran to her father when they arrived, hugging him tightly. Then she looked at Vexlar with curious eyes. "Are you the alien my dad saved?" she asked. "I am," Vexlar said, kneeling to her level. "And your father saved me many times. He is a very brave man." "He's scared sometimes," Rachel said matter-of-factly. "He has nightmares, but Mom says that's okay. She says being brave means doing hard things even when you're scared." Vexlar met Jake's eyes over Rachel's head. "Your mother is very wise." That evening, Vexlar sat with Jake's family for dinner. They ate Earth food, which was still strange to its Starian palate, and talked about normal things. School, weather, Rachel's upcoming birthday. It was peaceful and simple and perfect. "This is what we fought for," Jake said later, after Rachel had gone to bed. "Not glory or conquest. This. Family dinners. Children who can grow up safe. A galaxy where different species can sit together and share a meal." "We nearly lost it," Vexlar said. "We did lose it, for a while," Jake replied. "But we got it back. And now we know what it costs to keep it. We won't forget again." Vexlar returned to Unity Prime with a renewed sense of purpose. The Confederation had been built on ideals of peace and cooperation. Those ideals were still valid, but now they understood that ideals required defenders, that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to stand against those who would destroy it. 10 years after the war, Vexlar stood before a new class of cadets. They were young and eager, having grown up in the peace that had been won by sacrifice. He looked at them and began his lecture the same way he always did, with words that Jake Morrison had once spoken to him. "Today you will learn the difference between fearlessness and courage. The fearless do not understand the stakes. The courageous fight despite understanding them perfectly. The humans taught us this, and now we teach it to you." He paused, looking across the classroom, at faces from dozens of worlds, including several young humans. "You are the future of the Confederation. You will face challenges we cannot predict. But remember what we learned in the darkest days of the war. Fear is not weakness. It is awareness of what you might lose. And that awareness, that understanding of what is at risk, that is what makes you fight harder to protect it." Outside the academy, the galaxy turned under peaceful stars. Ships moved between worlds, carrying trade and travelers. Species that had once lived in isolation now worked together, bound by shared history and mutual respect. The peace was maintained not by pretending conflict could never happen, but by beings willing to face their deepest fears when something greater than themselves was at stake. The humans had taught them this lesson at terrible cost, and the Confederation would never forget it. Vexlar walked through the memorial gardens that evening, as he did every week. He touched the wall where Ben Carter's name was carved, and David Green's, and 60,000 others who had given everything. "We remember," he said quietly to the names, "and we honor your sacrifice by staying ready, by teaching the next generation, by never forgetting what you taught us about courage." The stars shone overhead, beautiful and eternal. And somewhere among them, humans and Confederation species stood watch together, guardians of the peace they had won, remembering always the real face of fear and the courage it took to stand against it.